Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Are we ready to start? In which case, let me say that as chair of this panel, I'm delighted to welcome you this afternoon to discuss once again about ethics and data protection. And I will go back to 2016. 2 years ago, I sat exactly on this podium and I announced the EDPS new project on ethics and data-driven technologies. It is fair to say that there were at that time some skeptical looks among friends within and outside the data protection community for different reasons. We see their points. However, there is a good signal to be now highlighted with you, and it relates once again to CPDP. CPDP, I think we may all agree, can be regarded as a weather vane for the most important current topics related to particularly, but not only, privacy and data protection. And this year, I counted a total of 11 panels at this conference, which, as described in the program available to all of you, explicitly address ethical questions. And this has, let's say, a meaning. So ethics and data protection seem intertwined like never before, and I observe an ever closer convergence between the two. Many issues related to ethics involve the processing of personal data. Data protection authorities within and outside the EU now face ethical questions that legal analysis alone cannot address. And whenever I approach an ethicist to talk about ethics, part of my motivation, I should be fair with you and honest, is to take a break from data protection, which is present in my daily life from 7 o'clock to midnight and perhaps even after. But I'm not successful, no such luck. They all want the ethicists to speak about data protection principles, and data protection and privacy is one of their biggest concerns. Just to give you an example, at the session this week in Davos on artificial intelligence, privacy was highlighted as the big question to be tackled. And yet, for data protection authorities, at least some of them, for data controllers, ethics is not yet a priority, though we have some notable exceptions. For instance, if you have a look to the excellent blog published recently by my good friend Elizabeth Denham, the UK Information Commissioner, you may have a different impression. But let us not to be critical. Data protection legal experts are partly exhausted by all the legal changes and the case law. They are, of course, right when they say that there is already a GDPR ethics. They focus on some ideas around accountability, about fairness, transparency, but in terms of honesty, let us not to pretend that the GDPR will by itself fix the glaring inequalities and unfairness which increasingly characterize the digitized society and economy. We're striving towards a new model of treating people with dignity in the midst of pervasive technology. We are looking for a simple maxim, a sort of digital Hippocratic oath, an oath which all can understand, from practitioners to patients in their digital operating activities in such a theater. And with the debate taking place this week, it will continue to grow, but not forever. Soon the new becomes the normal. And now, I think, is our window of opportunity in this convergence. I regret to say, you can even tweet on this, that data protection rules will not alone make the world a better place. They will give a strong contribution. Most of the companies today, within and outside the EU, want to be compliant with data protection rules. That's a good signal compared with what some of them declare in 1998. However, I continue to doubt that this will be enough to preserve a vivid democracy, our full autonomy of choice, our entire capacity to develop our own personality, to develop a new notion of dignity in the digital age. So technologies allows human minds to be hijacked. They're changing the way we think. They are making us less rational and more impulsive. Predictive algorithms are rating us in countless aspects of our life, and recent investigations show how much these systems may reinforce inequalities and exclusions. We love new technologies. We don't want to slow down innovation. The question is, are new technologies shaping our values? The GDPR adapts to new and not so new technology. It is reactive. Its aim is to avoid harms and mitigate risks for the individuals. It is inspired to a precautionary principle. It does not proactively support a project for the future of our society. I would like to be clear once again. I'm not trying to complement the GDPR with a new set of rules. But we have a more ambitious project. We are looking beyond, at least at the EDPS, beyond mere compliance mechanism. We would like to understand how the digital age is changing the society and the person's daily life. And we would like to see if ethics can do something about it. And this is why we're here once again today. So we'd like to introduce now the Ethics Advisory Group once again. The group we set up meets today for the last time to present its ideas to you. As you know, this has been a fully independent group. That means that even if we hosted the meetings, we didn't take part of them, apart from courtesy meetings. And they have approached in the last few hours the report, which has been just published on our website. I would like to really thank them for their excellent work, which has been done pro bono, entirely voluntarily. And therefore, we will ask them to be on board, because we're now approaching the Privacy and Data Protection Olympic Games in October this year in Brussels, and we need of their contribution. So the report will be subject to some comments, will be publicly available as said, and will represent one of the important main background documents for the conference. And I'm delighted Jim Dratwa, well-known Secretary of the European Group of Ethics in Science and Technology, moderates this panel. Why? Because it confirms the convergence I mentioned to you. We have been cooperating as EDPS and the two groups with the ethics group from the Commission. We will continue to cooperate in the future. They will be engaged in our conference. So it's time now I start acting as a sort of a silverback, remaining a little bit in a listening mode. And even in the next few months, I would like to be in a listening mode for comments, at least until June, where we would like to expand the conversation further. Further, as I said, because we would like to prepare all relevant background documents for the 40th edition of the International Conference. So it's time I stop and I continue monitoring here, from here, but so now it's over to Jim.
Thanks ever so much, Giovanni. I'm told that these should work, and indeed they do. Really, thanks so much. So exactly in the spirit of what you were saying, we have a stellar lineup of speakers, and I will introduce them to you before they speak. We've asked each of them to take the floor for around about 8 minutes, so that you have a great overview of interesting perspectives on the report, and at the same time we have enough time for questions. The questions will come after our four excellent panelists have expressed themselves, so hold on to those questions, write them down, tweet them perhaps, but don't lose them, and they'll give us a wonderful conversation afterwards. So let me first introduce Peter Burgess. I'm sure you know him, but let me remind you that he holds the chair in the geopolitics of risk at the École Normale Supérieure de Paris and is professor at the Center for Advanced Security Theory CAST at the University of Copenhagen, and he's also the chair of the Ethics Advisory Group. Without further ado, Peter, the floor is yours.
It's a sure thing. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. There's many stories we could tell about the ethics in the digital age, digital ethics as we've called it in our group. I want to suggest one of many. You may hear others from my colleagues here on the stage. It's the story of personhood, of the concept of the person in the European tradition. And when we talk about the protection of personal data, we're led immediately, according to this story, to ask, what is it that's being protected when personal data is being protected? What is it actually that's being protected? Is it the person, him or herself? Not exactly. It's not the person who's being protected, at least not in any simple way, in the way that a border or a wall or a protective garment would protect the person. No, it's not that kind of protection. But there's, of course, some sort of protection going on. And we want to ask, what is that protection? And what's the difference between that kind of protection and the sort of prophylactic or kinetic protection that we would have against physical harm? Answering that question might start by the observation that I am not my data. A person is not the person's data. And yet, we all know, everyone certainly in this room, that I'm increasingly, more incessantly represented in everything I do, essentially everything I do, as my data. Represented to others, to my friends, to my social groups, to the government, to the security forces, to just about everyone I have interest in interacting with. I'm represented increasingly by the aggregate of the data about me. Well, what is more interesting, more disconcerting, is that I'm increasingly represented to myself by my data. My own understanding of who I am, my ethical understanding of who I am, is increasingly represented through the data about me. I see myself, I seek to tailor the representation of myself, my data self, in a way that reinforces a certain kind of data self of my own. But what's strange is that representation isn't even personal anymore, because also, as we know, it's increasingly automated. It's automatic. And it's promulgated by people and processes and machines who don't even know me. So my representation to the world, to society, to myself, is becoming quite distant from who I think I am. And we're moving towards a situation, a historical situation, I think, where the most natural way of protecting me is protecting my data. That's an observation we might make along these lines. And then given that the person and personhood is so essential to the European project, from the very original philosophy of the European project to the actual core documents, the person is a core idea. What does it then mean that the person is increasingly represented through automated processes, algorithms? So this kind of narrative we can address, and we did address over the course of the last 2 years in our many deliberations, with two answers, two kinds of answers, two sets of answers. The one is a historical one. It says, well, what kind of historical conjuncture are we living in? What is this period? What's special about now which makes this situation so observable, so incessant, and actually so bothersome to many of them. Technology has always existed. Even communication technologies have always existed. Digital technologies are something more new. But what we cannot think, we can observe the changes all around us in the way we lead our social lives through digital technologies. There's no controversy at all about that. But what I think we have to conclude, and what we have concluded, is that the changes we see today are not simply, in a simple way, caused by technology. There's some sort of parallel process. Digital technologies are changing, and we are changing. So there's nothing about the person, the human, that's eternal, that's gone on forever. And we want to understand what's changing about humanity, about the person, about the legal and ethical subject, and how is it related to the changes that we see in digital technologies. This is what we call shifts in our report. The shifts in the way that we understand knowledge, the way we understand our existence, the way we understand our social and cultural settings and our relationship to each other. The second answer to this question is about values. That's shifts and values in the title of this panel tonight. So one way that any organization defines the human, and certainly the European Union as an organization is a leader in this, is through its values. A human being is a certain kind of being who holds a certain kind of values, a certain set of values. So this is a pure European approach, sort of a grandchild of natural law, is defining humans as holders of values. How they come to be the values that we hold is another question, and it's often not really taken up very, very directly. But the question that we pose in the group, and the question we pose relative to changing digital technologies, the changing technological scene, is how the traditional values that we hold so dear, that make the foundation of the European project, how they are impacted by the digital technologies. Are the values changing? Are they relevant today? So we could take, there are many examples, of course, in the European project. Take dignity or autonomy as the core values. Are we as autonomous as Immanuel Kant envisaged when he first defined dignity as part of the European spirit? Or are we far more dependent on the way that algorithms define us, that algorithms and automated processes ascribe values to us through the aggregation of our data? Is there something that's changing? Do we need to reinterpret these core values for the digital age? And that's something that more or less, with some discussion and lots of controversy, we've agreed in the group that we do need to indeed retool, reinterpret the traditional values, holding what seems to be eternal and reapplying them for the digital reality that we live in today.
Thanks ever so much. Issues of protection, of personhood. Protecting me is protecting my data, even though I'm not exactly my data. Changing technologies, changing values, changing selves. And indeed, the need to retool the values we hold dear in the face of those shifts. I see that the room is bubbling up with questions, but please hold on to them. As we said, we're gonna wait until all four speakers have spoken. And indeed, let me introduce you Antoinette Rouvois. Antoinette is Doctor of Laws of the European University Institute of Florence. She is Permanent Research Associate at the Belgian National Fund for Scientific Research, the FNRS, Senior Researcher at the Research Center Information Law and Society, the Law Faculty, and Professor of Questions of Applied Ethics after the Digital Turn in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Namur in Belgium. How topical. And Antoinette, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Peter, for that first speech, which very well introduced what I wanted to stress. As a specific shift that we identified was about what is called the scored society, from what we call from the actuarial society to the scored society. In fact, what we notice is that we are gradually shifting from a civilization of science and text towards a civilization of signals, computable signals, and algorithms. That, of course, for a lawyer is something that is really an important shift. As you know, law is the result of a very long and slow sedimentation of text, and now we are faced with a completely new paradigm of pure signal, pure quantification, and a society of metrics. So, in fact, all the digital pheromones that really proliferate from all our behaviors. By behavior, I mean all our trajectories online, but also offline, all the friends that we make on the internet, on social networks, all our relationships, all the supermarket we go in the evening when we need food, all these data that proliferate from our behaviors, in fact, do not render us more visible nor intelligible in our singularity, but they make us much more calculable in our behaviors. And what is quite strange is that it's a strange kind of quantification which does not relate to any kind of stable, conventional, explicit metric, but which relates to constantly evolving behaviors of others. So it's a strange kind of normativity which is really viral, which no one can ever stabilize. So in that context, people become taken or become engulfed in a phenomenon of absolute competition among each other at the level or at the quasi-molecular level of the intrapersonal data. So there are of course, new processes of valorization of oneself on the internet. We want to be quantified. If we are not quantified, we do not enter in the competition and we cannot compete. So we accept to give a lot of data. We accept to have a lot of data captured from our behaviors for that reason. So we are becoming used to live indexed life, in fact. So, but it's a trend that is difficult to resist. Why is that? Because the blindness of algorithms towards what makes the singularity of a life and also what inscribes each individual life in collective contexts, and rather the focalization of algorithms on what links in a way that is quite impersonal, what links each life statistically to impersonal but predictive profiles is precisely what confers to algorithmic processes their aura of impartiality, their aura of objectivity, and at the same time, what renders them completely alien to any kind of conception we can have of personhood, of who I am. So it's not, the problem is that scores and profiles, the problem is not that scores and profile are adequate to who I am, to how I behave, to my biography. The problem is that the things that are detected through profiles and scores, which are my propensities to mental diseases, my propensity to be to be a bad repayer of debts, for example, my propensity to become a radical religious person, these kinds of things which are detected thanks to algorithms, they are thought or conceived increasingly in a logic, in an epidemic logic. There is a kind of determinism that is growing, a determinism which is articulated not to the biography of each individual, but to the relations which are transpiring through digitization or datafication of behaviors. you know? So the crime, the risk of criminality, risk of recidivism, risk of bad repayment or failure to repay become seen as epidemic. If, for example, you live nearby a supermarket which has a lot of clients which are very poor and don't pay their debts, there is a risk that you cannot get a mortgage from the bank because you just, even if you have always repaid your debt, even if you have a good job, a well-paying job, you may be refused a loan because you know, you are in the vicinity of other people which don't pay their debts. So you see, it's a change in the way we perceive risks, and risks are detected. But a profile or a score is no one. It's no one. It's very far from the person, and that's a problem. It's not the adequacy that's a problem. It's that it's too far from the person. So, and also that tendency betrays a kind of obsession with real costs. Hyper-individualization of evaluations of opportunities and threats. You know, uncertainty has always been with us, and we have been used to deal with radical uncertainty by, for example, pooling risks. You know, you pool the risks, and you don't eliminate uncertainty, but the incompressible remain of uncertainty is shared among a lot of people. That's a principle of solidarity. But now, with big data and algorithms allowing for individual scores to be distributed to individual persons, the idea is that each person will have to pay for his or her real cost. You know, it's not real. I mean, scores are not true nor false. They are just reliable enough to nurture or to feed strategies of actions which are deemed optimal for the actors who use these dispositives. So you see there is a shift there. Of course, there are issues of values involved here. You see that the problem is not so much anymore the question of personal data and protecting each person in his or her personal data. In fact, nowadays, data are much more relational than they are personal. And the challenge we are faced with now is this one. How shall we protect the collective issues, the collective values, the collective frameworks we live in, which are impacted by the use of our digital pheromones? And that's a question. And how can data protection, you know, entrapped as it is in an individualistic view of personal data, evolve as to ensure that we keep going in the right direction in order to preserve the solidarities to which we are attached, if we are attached to them, you know? So I think I will keep it here then, because I'm...
because it's a wonderful point on which to end.
Okay,
yes.
Thank you very much.
No, thanks ever so much indeed. Really, really great. A society of metrics, of viral normativity, escaping stabilization, the blindness of algorithms to the singularity of each life, and then this intriguing, important point on personal data and relational data, and you know, how do we protect then values which we hold dear, such as solidarity? Thanks so much, really, and we pursue this exploration of the shifts with Jeroen van den Hoven. Jeroen is university professor and professor of ethics, ethics and technology at Delft University. He is founding editor-in-chief of the journal Ethics and Information Technology. He is the winner in 2009 of the World Technology Award for Ethics, and I should add that he is also an esteemed member of the European Group on Ethics in Science and New Technologies. Jeroen, please, the floor is yours.
I think. Yeah. Great. So thank you. I've really appreciated serving on this committee, and it has dealt with all of the topics that you have heard my colleagues speak about, and you will hear more about. But what I was really impressed about was the initiative by itself by Giovanni Buttarelli to cast the net really wide and to start to think about what really is at stake. And I think he was right to frame it in terms of digital ethics. The digital technologies are converging, but also the ethical issues are converging. It's very difficult to separate out the autonomy and the privacy and the property and the transparency and all of these issues. They're all, as the technologies are converging and merging and forming all kinds of fascinating combinations, these are also emerging. And therefore we need to stand back and see what's really at stake. And that is, of course, human beings in a digital society. What they need, what their rights are, what the quality of their life is, and whether they can make sense of themselves, as Peter and Antoinette have been saying. So that's what's at stake. And the people who are here in the audience, of course, know full well that information is incredibly important in that respect. Information is a way to get to people. They can be exploited, they can be discriminated against, they can be harmed, they can be killed, they can be in subtle ways and insidious ways be manipulated. And so that is what is at stake. And therefore, I think we need to look at it from that point of view. And if we don't do that, I think we have a problem. In order to cast the net wider, I think we need to revisit some of our ethical tools, some of the basic concepts that we've been working with. And that is, for example, as Giovanni has also sometimes drawn attention to, the idea of data. So it is not only personal data, but it is also the data that are not in a strict sense about persons, but can be used to get to people, right? In the end, we will know whether they have served for that purpose or not. And so I've talked in the past about identity-relevant data, every data that is relevant to get to people in the end. I think we also need to cast the net wider in terms of looking at systems of systems of systems. If you look at the data, big data ecosystem, it is much broader than just this or that, a little kind of application or system or connection between databases, etc., and software that is running. It is a very intricate and very elaborate system, and it needs to be kind of described and analyzed and evaluated as such. Furthermore, agency is a very important notion, and it is distributed, and we need to kind of look for where the agency is residing. Why? Because that is a step forward to attributing and allocating responsibility. And so we need to identify where the agency in these kind of systems of socio-technical systems is residing in order to adequately and in a nuanced way to attribute responsibility. We have made it very difficult on ourselves because evolution has made it possible for us to become the ethical beings that we are. And now we have created, scaffolded by the same kind of the results of the evolution, wonderful technology, but we have lost our way in that very complex technological society. And one of the results of that is that we have trouble in allocating responsibility. And that was a very important ingredient in being the kind of the moral beings that we are, that we relate to each other in a way that is grounded in relationships of responsibility. And so we need to find where the agency is, have very precise, let's say, ethical instruments in order to help ourselves to that new kind of framework. I sometimes compared it to, you know, we're trying to repair a Swiss precision watch with a sledgehammer. The world is so very complex, it's very complicated, and we come to it with very crude notions of ethical notions like responsibility, and that is just too crude an instrument, right? And so we need to develop not only the technologies, but we also need to develop our ethical instruments. And that is a new way of doing ethics. That is, it calls for a way of designing for these ethical notions and all the values that have been mentioned, like privacy and democracy. And if we don't intentionally and very consciously and meticulously design for those values, we will go nowhere. You know, all our ethical deliberations and cogitations will just not be effective. So that's a very important one. I was struck by a remark by Angela Merkel in Davos yesterday, I think. She said, what we all know, data will be the raw material of the 21st century. The question who owns that data will decide whether democracy, the participatory social model, and economic prosperity can be combined. Well, it's almost as if she had been reading our kind of report, because that is one of our key recommendations or observations, that we need to combine the use of the digital technologies and the big data, and at the same time, of course, respect all the values and the ethical considerations that we have brought to the table. So it is that combination. Yeah. And that is what we draw attention to the European idea of responsible innovation and designing for values. And of course, you're all familiar with this idea for designing for privacy, designing for data protection and by privacy by design, but it's much broader. We need to be able to design for accountability and dignity even, and democracy, and all of these notions. And that is, again, that calls for a shift in the way we do ethics and the way we conceive of ethics. So, and that sounds very simple, but it's very difficult to do. I'm of the opinion that unless we can conceive of digital innovation as a moral endeavor, I think we are in a bad situation.
Great, thanks. Really, thanks a lot. Casting a wide net in terms of digital ethics, but also in terms of envisaging the system of systems, the question of distributed agency in order to be able to allocate responsibility, the need really to refine our ethical instruments, and as a condition to be able to design for the values that we want to uphold. Brilliant. And now we turn our attention to you, Aurélie. Aurélie Pauls is an economist, an econometrist and statistician by education, and has been involved in the analysis of data from the very beginning of this activity. She's an important actor in the field of digital data, and she runs her own consulting business in Spain after selling her own first startup, her first company a few years ago. Aurélie, thanks so much. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you for having me. So thank you for your introductions and also for your inputs. Maybe to close down this chapter before we come to the questions and the drinks as well afterwards. During my years of official training and education, there were basically two subjects to which I paid very little attention. It started in secondary school, and the first one was philosophy. I preferred mathematics, and it continued at university as I preferred statistics and econometrics to any kind of stuffy, static teaching of the law. So you can imagine when I was asked to join the ethics advisory group, I totally felt at home. Just as I feel like at these conferences, compared to the ones on big data, more technological and less gender balanced. So being a data geek, I logically turned to the internet for a very simple reason, which we talked about as well, which is data. And the sheer proliferation of it compared to going to the Institut National de Statistics to get diskettes to support my business models for the companies I was working for. It's really has evolved since then. So the idea was to have data to render decision-making less subjective, one project at a time. And I turned into an internet entrepreneur, and we were going to change the world order. We're going to model these decisions, these decision-making processes, to render them more objective, to optimize case by case, depending on the topics we worked on. And it allowed us also for new life choices, to become independent entrepreneurs in charge of our own lives, not employees with all the risks and freedoms that this entailed. It meant blurring of professional and private lives, and for some of us, it also meant entering the joyful game of having venture capitalists back our endeavors, which is also rather important. So I was lucky because my family backed it, so no debt, and as an economist, or maybe despite being an economist, I have a problem with debt. But independent of the type of financial backing, time has also taught me an important lesson. It's not easy being an entrepreneur. You sacrifice a lot. And the end game is also the same, is always the same, getting acquired. This is also where you go through euphoria, even more sacrifices during your earn-out period, to then inevitably, I have come to the conclusion, fall into depression. So economic research has shown that 80% of mergers and acquisitions fail. And if you ask me today what my greatest achievement was when selling my company, besides the nice sum in my bank account, is the fact that I watched people evolve and grow. And the human aspect is what made it worth it. And as a serial entrepreneur reminded me a long time ago, there's just so many cocktails you can drink in Barbados. So my world is one where you move fast and break things, where you throw ideas at the wall and see if it sticks. I've been taught over the 20 years to keep it simple and stupid. There's an acronym for that, which is KISS, which typically doesn't work for the it depends stances I hear more often in this environment when we talk about legislation, and certainly when we talk about the shifts in our values and what makes for the basis of the European project. Data science is a black and white world, a bit like US movies, where you feel good at the end because the good guys win, and not puzzled or depressed as sometimes when watching French cinema. Don't get me wrong, I have an eclectic taste and appreciate it immensely while refusing to watch Black Mirror. For this crowd, I imagine, I intend to personalize and oversimplify things. For the big data, AI, machine learning crowd, I make things too complicated. In between, I am puzzled yet free, autonomous in a way, while also minimizing risk, but that's another discussion. Okay, enough about me. So getting back to the EAG, a tremendous honor and a challenge. I learned something remarkable thanks to Antoinette. The law is a very powerful box of Lego, possibly more powerful than technology, as it doesn't sit in isolation, like most startups who haven't found their market fit. Think of the building blocks that make up the GDPR today, as you take the notions of data controller, processor, even joint controllers for granted. This idea of consent, or even the fact that law kicks in when PII, personal data, personal information is processed, has been created one way or another. It doesn't fall from the sky. The building blocks of the law address the evolution of society and define which kind of society we want. And if I may continue the comparison with respect to technology, it rapidly becomes obsolete. Anyone who has been through interwoven migrations, for those who remember content management systems, before world press and social media, knows that the foundation of technology become rapidly obsolete and don't address long-term, bigger picture issues. If you have put your finger into APIs or SDKs or other data integration schemes, you know they are built to fix short-term requests. I flocked to the internet because of the data, as I said in the beginning. I am faced today with tremendous data quality issues, plenty of it yet not freely given, and a prediction is not the same thing as a fact, some things that are highlighted also in the report. Data, interestingly, also has become a barrier to entry, dividing those that have it and those that do not dispose of training data. Obviously, other issues have arisen, such as representativity of population. Certainly, when you follow the KISS principle and orally, don't make that too complicated. So now I think the data debate is possibly not the most important aspect of the white paper. And I welcome very much this focus of shifts and values put together and agreed upon by Peter, Jeroen, and Luciano. This white paper lays the groundwork for discussions about which kind of digitalized world we want to build and live for children, assuring also intergenerational solidarity, where possibly this aspect of human flourishing might not be inclusive enough, just like optimizing from a single angle and having overwhelming market share is possibly not enough to assure recital 4 of the GDPR is respected. The processing of personal data should be designed to serve mankind. It could be rewritten as the processing of data should be designed to serve humanity, but I'm not here to discuss the GDPR. I do, however, see it as an evolution, a welcomed evolution in the digital Wild West. I have learned to move fast and break things while not raising questions. And while we all scratch our heads to embrace and put to work the principles of accountability to figure out the GDPR, we still have a long way to go to assure incentives are aligned. So hopefully this document is a way forward in the debate. Thank you very much.
Jane.
Thanks so much.
Now,
Of course.
we've been listening this individual, let's say, complementary comments to the report now available to all of you. We'd like to take this opportunity to pay tribute to other two missing experts. Luciano Floridi, who was unable to join us today. He contributed as well to the report, as well as Jaron Lanier, who contributed remotely in regular stages. I've seen a lot of good input for a debate. Peter started by saying, I'm not my data. Then Antoniette started by focusing on how difficult it is to resist to certain trends. And I've heard a lot of comments about the risk of let's say, collective use of data regardless of, let's say, adverse effect on single individuals. And this leads to a prediction that perhaps the notion of personal data may disappear in 10 years from now, at least by a substantive viewpoint. Anyway, the absence of these two members may allow to make profit of this remaining 20 minutes for some burning questions. Perhaps someone would like to act as icebreaker. So I give you back the floor, and I think you may lead the discussion in a very efficient way.
That's great. Thanks ever so much, Giovanni. And indeed, you were finishing your excellent presentation with this question of the interactions between technology, ethics, and the law, and indeed with the importance of raising questions. And this is where we turn to you. Yes, absolutely. Now, we're happy to share some of the microphones that we have on stage, unless there is some way that you can, yeah, if it's easy for you to go there, then please do so, and otherwise we'll bring you a microphone from the stage.
Thank you very much. I'm Charles Rabb from the University of Edinburgh. I haven't read the report, and I'm sort of itching to get hold of it and read it, but even in advance, I'd like to commend the whole enterprise for producing something which will, I hope and I'm sure, advance our thinking. The question I wanted to ask is this. In view of some of the remarks that have been made from the panel, particularly, I suppose, Antoinette and Peter, Suppose your report had been available 5 years ago. Do you think it would have had much traction, and what traction might it have had on the drafting of the GDPR? Because if you look at the GDPR, as we all have done, you find, one finds oneself saying, gee, if only the GDPR had embraced more firmly the idea that there are impacts beyond that of individuals and beyond that of individual privacy, but that go into other sorts of social values and so on, which is a perception that we've heard this afternoon and is probably, I hope, in the report. Do you think it would have affected the process and the outcome of the GDPR if they had had that kind of thinking not available? I don't mean a report, but a discourse that would have circulated around the report, feeding into the process of producing a regulation. Thank you.
Thanks ever so much. Very tricky, very interesting question. I leave it to all 5 of you to take it up. And just to say, if you have questions which you'd like to raise, please do not hesitate to go in front of that microphone, and that will be a perfect way to proceed with that.
Yes, thank you very much. This is indeed a very good question and a very tricky one indeed, and politically, I would say, touchy question as well. I'm not sure. I do hope it would have changed some things in the process and also the results of the discussions leading to the GDPR, which is already an achievement, of course, but which doesn't go far enough in order to take on board all the issues which are the most pressing issues, which are the issue arising not from personal data, but from the possible aggregations and inductions made from even anonymous data. You know, you don't need personal data in order to personalize things or to profile people or their behaviors in quite precise manners. So I hope it would have changed something, but I doubt, I'm not sure it would have, because that would have had as a consequence that Europe would have had to regulate quite strictly the proliferation and the collection of even non-personal data. It's quite logic that the European Union wants data to flow easily and to proliferate, because big data is said to be good for innovation, and innovation is nowadays an absolute logic, even if you don't know what innovation for what it is. It's good for competitivity, and sometimes it's enough as an argument. I don't find it enough. I think we have to think back to what Gaston Berger invented when he first said the word prospective. And prospective is not just, you know, generalizing tendencies and trying to make the most and to optimize your actions in order to take the most you can from the speculative spaces that you create by extending what's already there, you know. Prospective has to do with deciding in common what the future must look like and how different it must be from what it is. And I think that that effort of prospective, which is a political effort, may not have been done enough, I think. Instead, there was the tendency was really to favor the European competition, which is a noble end in its own, but it cannot be the only one, I think. Optimization must sometimes be put aside when there are other goals to fulfill. For example, the pursuit of justice, the pursuit of equality of opportunity, of solidarity, and of a livable and sustainable ecosystem. I think these are really political goals that could or should even sometimes prevail over optimization and pursuit of competitivity. Besides, I think that pursuit of these valuable goals, ethical goals, are not a constraint, are not diminishing the possibility for innovation. On the opposite, I really believe that these are productive constraints, and which could make the European innovation much different and much better, I would say, than other kinds of innovations which are more specific to other areas of the world. I think we have something to play here, even on an economic and competition level.
Jim, may I abuse for a couple of minutes of my role to say a word? All questions from Charles Raab, as usual, are very challenging. So thank you for contributing to the debate. Digital ethics does not come from the blue. It was already partly there years ago. But I think what we have in mind today is also linked to recent development of certain new technologies, which were not so, let's say, present at that time. The concentration of data in the hands of few, and artificial intelligence, so is a more recent reality. But your question allows me to remind you that due to some good friends, GDPR already contains all the elements relevant in terms of ethics: transparency, fairness, accountability. Others believe that accountability is the only platform where ethics is to be developed, while I'm afraid we are thinking to something else. I don't know if one day we will have a legal framework saying that the processing of personal data is only lawful and fair, provided that you also respect, in addition to certain precautionary rules, also ethical principles. Perhaps it's too early. And perhaps the digital ethics will be developed outside, entirely outside the data protection legal framework. So I'm not sure an early debate would have a different impact. That's my small contribution to the question.
Please go ahead. This is such a, there's another question coming up. Okay, so maybe we can provide rather short answers, or, yeah?
No, I think it's very difficult, Charles, to do this kind of counterfactual history or a policy impact analysis. But it's, I think, if we would have had a report, kind of irrespective of the contents of this report, but you know, the report or the gesture of the EDPS 5 years ago to put ethics on the agenda squarely and say, well, there is actually more, and we have to think beyond the GDPR and positive law, because the problems are so large that are coming. They're all interconnected. We need to shift gears, right? That I think that would have been a very important statement at that time. Look at how narratives or discourses or debates are kind of, you know, reaching a tipping point, as with to, for example, debates about Silicon Valley. You know, a year ago, everyone was kind of, you know, oh, this interesting stuff. Now, suddenly, everyone is very, very critical, also here in Brussels. I mean, so these kind of movements can make a huge difference when they're timed, you know, rightly. So.
Sure. I mean, first and foremost, of course, it's the existence of the GDPR which provoked and made possible the wisdom of the Ethics Advisory Group. So I think the EAG wouldn't have been possible without the GDPR, and from a certain point of view. On the other hand, to answer your question, I think in a careful way and in probably in a different way than you are referring to, yes, it would have impacted. There's a fundamental difference between law and ethics. In law, the normative dimension, the coercion, if you like, is external. In ethics, it's internal. Ethics is a relation to the self. Law is a relationship to another, of which it's more complicated than this. I'm simplifying, but you see the point. So the ethical question is a question about what kind of relationship we have to each other, to ourselves as society, what kind of relationship we have to this European project. So the general background of dignity and autonomy, which is the background of the GDPR, might have been different. In one technical way, I think it could have been different. The reflection, what we hear about trust, emanating from the GDPR, I think is mistaken. I don't think the GDPR will raise trust in anybody except in those who are in the position of exerting coercion or punishment or meting out the retributive claims. Trust is, coercion brings trust only in authorities. It's not a trust of oneself or trust in one's own community that will come out of this. And I think our reflection, and you can read in the report our reflection that we've made about trust, would confirm this.
Great, thanks so much. So we're at this point with around about 10 minutes left where we agreed that we would collect questions. So we're very much looking forward to your question. If there are other questions, please do come along and ask them, and then we will answer collectively. Yes, please go ahead.
My name is Johann Schaas. I'm from the Austrian Academy of Sciences, and I would like to say that I share very much the diagnosis which was presented at the panel today. I'm less clear or maybe more concerned about the conclusions. So I would like to take up the question of Charles Raab. What will be happen or the consequence in 5 years? Will this report contribute to a society which is more adjusted to the, let's say, technology imperative, or will it contribute to a society which contributes to a society in which we do not need to reinterpret values, but to reinforce, to strengthen values, and which we don't have to analyze responsibility, but we assign responsibility to policymaking, in which possibly instead of the imperative of innovation, competitiveness, solidarity plays a stronger role. Thank you. It's a very complicated question also.
An excellent question. Are there other questions which you would like to? Yes, please come. Go ahead. Absolutely great.
Hi, Scott Robbins from Delft. I actually was picking up on something that you said, Professor van den Hoven, on the distribution of agency, and how, and I agree that it's so important to figure this out and then to assign, do this ascription of responsibility. However, I'm a little bit worried about what we might find, and I'm curious as to your thoughts on expanding about this concept, because, you know, we might find that we have all these agents working, especially in the age of artificial intelligence and robotics, that can't accept responsibility in the sense that we're probably thinking about, which isn't just causal responsibility, but you know, we're holding them responsible in the way we normally do. So interesting. Just
perfect timing for a last question. If you'd like to go to the microphone, great. And then a quick round of answers and closing by Giovanni.
Simple question. Would you advocate for separate ethical impact assessments for systems, processes, organizations, implementations, deployments, or including those in privacy impact assessments or data protection impact assessments?
Thanks so much. So 3 excellent questions. One about looking forward, technology imperative versus placing values first. A second one about distribution of agency. And then this third very good question about do we need a separate impact assessment? And we have a sort of a pop-up round of answers. You can pick and choose and keep it short. I know it's very challenging.
I can maybe take the last one to make it short and sweet. There was a panel yesterday also on legitimate interests, and during the discussion about those balancing tests, when this basis is used for lawfulness of processing, there was a discussion about uses of ethical models, or what would come into play within these balancing tests that would run parallel to privacy data protection impact assessments, but would probably be broader. So this is where I start to see a link between how do I do those balancing tests today to justify under the accountability principle the use of legitimate interests. I think the work goes beyond that as well. So there's a bit that is what we have contributed here that would help define more clearly data protection impact assessments, those balancing tests. but as I said in my presentation, it doesn't stop there. There should be more evolution related to what digital ethics actually means, and if it only translates into legislation or other things is something that will await us in the next years to come. So, thank you.
If an ethics impact assessment is possible, then we have failed in our group. Ethics impact in some sort of finite, determinate way is counter to the very idea of ethics. So ethics needs to be an ongoing redefinition of the self, redefinition of society, re-questioning. It never reaches a point where the impact can be measured in a quantitative way. As for society and the impact, Jan, as we point out in the report, the algorithmic era we live in has a risk of weakening democratic institutions, democratic processes, if we have succeeded in pointing out points of resistance where we can be more aware of where we're not being aware of the influences on our democratic voice, then we will have had a positive impact on society.
Nice. So Jeroen and then Antoinette, if you can keep it very short, and then
I can answer, I think, to try to answer two questions at the same time. The question about the agency and responsibility distributed, etc., and the other one about values and innovation. Responsibility is an example of where you have to, an agency, by the way, these things need to be designed for. They will not happen automatically. So if we leave it to the market and to people who invent all kinds of new digital wonderful stuff, then the outcome will not be meaningful human control, as the term is used in robotics or in with respect to high-tech systems. So you need to design for meaningful human control and agency if you don't want to go down the route of ascribing responsibility to machines. And I certainly don't want to go down that route. I want to stick to meaningful human control and agency in systems. This means that you help yourself to a very sophisticated theory of agency and responsibility and apply that to the very complex digital world in an adequate way so that you are accountable and that you know who's doing what and who's taking responsibility for what and who can be held in a justified way accountable for what.
Yes, I'll just say a few words about the first question and a few words about the last one. The first one, I don't think there is a technical imperative. It doesn't exist as such. You know, there is a responsibility which is ours to tame that technical imperative or their pretensions of technical imperative. I think speaking of technological imperative is a way of disresponsabilizing ourselves or depoliticizing things which really deserve public democratic debates. So it's our responsibility. And if algorithms are problematic, they're not problematic. What is problematic is our tendency, because of our laziness, our tendency to renounce to govern ourselves and to govern our environment and shift that responsibility to automatic dispositives. So, and we will not get rid of that responsibility. That's our responsibility, not to get rid of our responsibility. And now for the last one, the separate impact assessment, I just want to make a short note about some doubts that I have. When will impact assessment arise? In a big data universe, even personal data processing or data processing, which apparently is innocuous at time t, may become very dangerous and very sensitive at time x. Why is it so? Because individual data may not have any meaning nor utility nor value at the time it is collected. But then when it is aggregated with other data which are collected later on, then they can reveal even very sensitive things about people. So there is a question of temporality. That's the reason why constant monitoring, constant vigilance, not to only looking at algorithms, but looking at the social reality we live in, looking at the material world we live in is very important. So it's important not only to look at algorithms, it's also important to look at what data feed algorithm. Why are these data and not others selected? And what's the material world we live in? What are the relations of power at time t, you know, which impact on the issues? Well, that's it. Sorry.
Thanks. Wonderful. A huge thanks to all. And we all turn to you, Giovanni.
No, just to say thank you, everybody from the panel and from the audience. Today's debate, once again, confirms to me what Jérôme has said. It has been a good idea to launch a wider debate. Opinions adopted by my good predecessor, Peter Hustings, already contained some important nuances at that time. But now we decided, since the GDPR is a reality, to have a wider debate. We do not claim to have a solution to all the problems. What is essential is that against those considering that they are not paternalistic regulators, we understand how the issue of the imbalance in terms of digital dividend can be dealt with. We have heard a lot of good ideas, so Jim, switch on your key because your group should contribute a lot. Be on board on this sort of mini public consultation. Send emails and comments, speak privately with all EDPS staff members around, and see you in October for a fruitful discussion at the open session of the Olympic Games on Privacy and Data Protection. Thank you for your attention.